Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Jeff Bakewell, and I direct the search program here at Rhodes. I'd like to begin by thanking a few entities that have made tonight's event possible, namely the Spence L. Wilson Chair in the Humanities, the Rhodes Lecture Board, and the search program. I'm happy to introduce this evening's speaker, the ingenious Darrin McMahon, the Ben Wider Professor of History at Florida State University. Professor McMahon comes by his considerable learning honestly. He's a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and of Yale, where he received his PhD in 1998. He is by training and inclination an intellectual and cultural historian with a focus on 18th and 19th century Europe, especially France. He's written a number of well-regarded, wide-ranging, and influential books, including Enemies of the Enlightenment, The French Counter-Enlightenment and the Making of Modernity, published by Oxford University Press, Happiness, a History, and now Divine Fury, a History of Genius. He's also edited several fine volumes and been a fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at Columbia, the Remarque Institute at NYU, and the Viennese Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen. In the bright arc of his career, he has become a rara avis, that is to say, a rare bird, somebody who is both a first-rate scholar and a genuinely leading public intellectual, whose writing has often graced the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Daedalus. Professor McMahon comes to us today hot off the cover of the review section of the Chronicle of Higher Education. And he's going to be talking to us today about the subject of that latest book I mentioned, his Divine Fury, which offers a history of the idea of the genius. Put differently, he asks what we can learn from past and present conceptions of geniuses, those, quote, avengers of humanity, those apostles of liberty, those rivals of the gods. So, without further ado, I would like to invite you to lean back and enjoy what is certain to be a congenial and invigorating lecture. Without further ado, Professor McMahon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you to Jonathan Judaic in particular, who was really kind in pulling together such a wonderful audience tonight. All right, we're going to be careful with the feedback, or they're going to be careful. I was telling someone this afternoon that I've only been to Memphis once before, and that was about 25 years ago. I've changed a lot since then, not only for the worse. Part of the change is that I've lived in the South now for the last 10 years almost, and I've come to develop a real appreciation for the diversity of Southern culture. And so it's a genuine pleasure for me to be here tonight and to share some thoughts with you. And I'm grateful to you for having me. All right. I'm a historian, which means that I usually talk about dead people. It's something we don't do as much in our culture today as I think we ought to. But we do like to talk about the present, and I want to begin just briefly in the present and point out that we use the word genius all the time today. And yet we use it in a way very different from the way it's been used over the last several thousand years. We talk about geniuses as rock stars. We talk about geniuses as pastry chefs. We talk about geniuses as sporting heroes. We use the word so often and so loosely that the critic Marjorie Garber wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly several years ago entitled "Our Genius Problem." And the problem, as Garber sees it, is that we have too many of them. Right? You can go to the Genius Bar at the Apple Store. You can give your children baby Mozart products and baby Einstein products. You probably know a genius. You too may be a genius, or at least you can learn how to become one. And there's in fact a thriving self-help literature today that promises just this: right? To think like a genius, right? Think like Leonardo. We've pluralized and democratized the concept to such an extent that today the genius is ordinary. There's genius in all of us. I want to try to explain this evening briefly how we got to this point. Just turn this off? Okay. All right, I guess I can. not just turn this one on? I'd rather walk around, but, well, okay. How's that? Better? I like to assault the audience a little bit at the beginning, just a little sort of noise, terror. Sorry about that. Okay, but now I can't walk around in the same way. Well, try my best. So I want to try to explain this evening how we got to this point, how it is that everyone is a genius, everyone has their 15 minutes of genius. And in doing so, to chart the somewhat surprising history of this enigmatic creature we call the genius, to chart the birth, life, and as I'll suggest, the death, perhaps, of genius. Now, there have been wise men and wise women in all places and all times. Prophets, poets, sibyls, scholars, shamans, sages. And yet the genius is an ideal of the highest human type, a paragon of originality, imagination, creativity, intuition, and brilliance, is a relatively new creation. In fact, one of the things I try to do in the book is explain how the genius emerges as a new cultural hero in the 18th century and why it is that the genius emerges in the 18th century. But it's certainly the case that there were precedents for the genius's emergence, precedents that go all the way back to the ancient world. And in fact, my book begins there in classical antiquity and picks up on a conversation that informs and influences later discussions. It's a conversation that focuses on a central question. What is it that makes the greatest individuals great? What accounts for that extraordinary human prowess of the mind? The Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero described this ineffable something as a quidem divinum, a divine something, and his choice of language, I would argue, is revealing. It was revealing because it's been difficult, if not impossible, for human beings, for the ancients and for many people thereafter, to imagine human greatness without some kind of divine aid or assistance. Great individuals were like gods, and they became godlike in one of two principal ways. Either they were possessed by a higher power, or they were possessors themselves of some inherent quality that set them apart. So take Homer, the greatest of the ancient poets, prophets, and bards, who lived most likely toward the end of the 8th century BCE, although we don't know for sure, but who in any case was already regarded by the golden age of Greece in the 5th century as a paragon, as a model of his type. Homer was inspired, it was believed, blown into by a divine breath. And it helps to keep in mind, and I realize that many of you are in the search program, and so you will have read a lot of the books that I'm referring to tonight, and you will know the etymologies, but it helps to keep in mind that the word that we use in English, inspire, comes from a Latin term, spirare, which means literally to breathe, and the idea that Homer had was that he was breathed into by a muse, right? Blown into by the breath of the gods. And he tells us this right at the beginning of two of the most famous works in the Western literary tradition, the Iliad and the Odyssey, both of which begin literally with an incantation. Right? Sing in me, muse, of the anger of Achilles, or sing in me, muse of the man of twists and turns. The bard is a kind of medium who is taken over and possessed by a divine voice. Plato very famously developed a whole theory of this process, which he likened to a kind of mania or madness, when the poet or the prophet or the seer is caught up in what he calls the divine fury of creative possession, and hence the title of my book. So that's one way of conceiving of artistic or intellectual greatness. The other is to consider why someone like Homer should attract the favor of the gods in the first place. And one influential answer is that these kinds of people have different kinds of souls, right? Different natures, that they possess something that other human beings don't have. Aristotle developed this line of inquiry, and in a famous text that was long attributed to Aristotle, we now know is written by someone else, maybe one of Aristotle's students, hence the name, the Pseudo-Aristotle. The pseudo-Aristotle develops this line of inquiry in a famous text called The Problems. And in problem 30, this question is posed. Why is it that all those who become eminent in philosophy or politics or poetry, the arts, are clearly of a melancholy temperament, right? And some of them to such an extent as to be affected by diseases caused by black bile? Well, the reference here is, of course, to the later Galenic notion of the humors, the idea that character, that personality is formed by some combination of the four principal humors, right? Black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. And of course, we still use these terms today. We talk about people as being phlegmatic, right, if they're straightforward, or sanguine if they're optimistic, or melancholy if they're prone to sadness or depression. To be melancholy is literally to have a superabundance of black bile. And what the pseudo-Aristotle is asking us to consider is that people who have a common, sort of common physiology, as we would put it, have a particular aptitude, that there may be something in common between great poets, great statesmen, great philosophers, that they might have a common constitution. Whether this quidem divinum, though, is given to us at birth or breathed into us by a god or muse, this divine something is conceived as a gift of the gods or God. And most often these two explanations go together. People with great souls drew the favor of the gods, and people who draw the favor of the gods have great souls. You get a really vivid sense of this conflation in the Roman cult of the genius. A word that is spelled just like our modern genius, and of course we get the term from the Latin genius. And yet the Roman genius is something very different from our modern notion of genius. A genius was literally a god of birth who watches over all human beings, or more specifically, really all men. And in fact, it's worth pointing out, and this is something we can talk about more if you'd like in questions, that notions of genius are, as academics say, gendered male from the start. They have a kind of inbuilt prejudice that men are somehow more susceptible to or more capable of creativity and higher intelligence than women. And this is a prejudice, one of many, that dogs the history of genius right from the very beginning. So the genius, then, the genius in this Roman conception, watches over all males from birth to death, and acts as a kind of intercessor to the divine, a guardian or tutelary spirit. This is a fresco from Pompeii, and this figure right here in the center is a genius with an offering plate there and a cornucopia and the veil to perform a sacrifice. It's probably the case that our notion of the birthday celebration comes from this Roman celebration of what Ovid calls the festum geniale, the yearly sacrifice that one made to one's god of birth. You light a cake and some candles, maybe some incense, and pour out a libation of wine as a way of honoring your own private god or spirit. So all men have a genius, but some people's geni, right, quite clearly are greater than others. The genius in them, as it were, is more powerful. They have greater ingenium. Okay, and if we go back to that root here, ingenium is the way that the Romans talk about innate talent or innate capacity or capabilities, and it's formed really from just the prefix in and then the accusative form of the word genius, literally the genius in us. So some people have greater ingenium, and some people have a greater genius or genius. And there's a whole classical tradition devoted to speculating about the geni of great men. The most famous being the genius of Socrates, or what the Greeks called his daimonion, which is just the diminutive of daimon. It's another little tutelary spirit. And, every Roman household from the mid-Republic forward would have had a little votive offering like this, a little shrine devoted to the genius. So Socrates had a daimonion, the diminutive of daimon, and it's really just the sort of Greek equivalent of the Latin notion of genius, right? So this is an ancient rendering of Socrates' great daimonion, this voice that prevented him from doing things, but a whole tradition develops speculating about how this private spirit gave him privileged access to the gods, right? It was a sort of private voice, a private window into the heavens. That was a classical rendering. This is much later by the French painter Jean Delacroix. It's a fresco that's actually in the corner of the National Assembly. And you'll notice that the diamond here, or the genius, looks rather like an angel. And that's not entirely coincidental, because this classical conversation about private tutelary spirits or guardians gets Christianized in turn and then sustained for centuries thereafter. And one of the things that happens is that the Roman cult of the genius feeds into the Christian cult of the guardian angel and also the guardian saint, the patron saint. And indeed, if you look up the word genius in European languages well into the 17th century, you'll invariably find a definition like that of Henry Cockeram's English Dictionary of 1623, which reads, genius, in the soul entry, a good angel or a familiar evil spirit, the soul. Some of you have probably seen Animal House, right? There's the famous scene when the young pledge is standing over a young woman who has had too much to drink, and he's deciding whether he should take her home or something else. And his guardian angel comes up and is offering one line of attack, and his guardian demon another. Well, there's a whole long Christian tradition of just this, of the Christian knight, Christian soul being fought over constantly, literally by guardian angels. Yeah, can we? Is it? Sorry? The water? Okay. No more water? No? Believe me, I feel it up here too. We just, I don't know what to say. Maybe we can turn it down a little bit? Or you can, if I speak louder, I'll speak over the... It doesn't make sense. If I speak really loud, you won't be able to hear the ring. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. We could just turn it off altogether, and I could speak really loudly, and then we wouldn't have the problem at all, right? Okay. I'll keep going. So you get the Christian knight here, whose soul literally is being fought over by a good genius and an evil genius, a good angel and a guardian angel. There's a long tradition, as I say, of thinking of this not as just a metaphor, but an actual literal fight where demons and good angels fight for one's soul. You'll also hear echoes in many of these later Christian accounts of the classical discussion of the divine fury or of great natures, great ingenium. And that's especially true in the Renaissance, when Plato's notion of the divine fury and the Aristotelian conception of the humors of great men are self-consciously revived and spread and applied to outstanding individuals like Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael, who are talked about as divinely inspired or in possession of divine natures, divine ingenium. We're getting closer in this Renaissance discussion of great artists to something like a modern conception of genius, and yet we're not quite there yet. There are a number of reasons why this is the case, but really largely because the modern understanding of genius is predicated on a belief in total originality. At the end of the 18th century, the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant will say famously, summing up what's really a whole centuries-long reflection, that everyone agrees that genius must be considered the very opposite of a spirit of imitation. Right? Originality, he says, is genius's foremost property. A little later, Wordsworth, the English poet, will say that genius is the introduction of a new element into the intellectual universe. In the modern reckoning, genius involves doing or thinking or making something which no one else has done. Okay? Well, that's a belief that's entirely second nature to us now. We value creation and creativity, and our entire economy, really, backed up by a legal system of intellectual copyright, operates on the assumption that to create is to create something new. But that's actually a recent and radical departure from the norm. Because really until the 18th century, creation and a notion of creative originality were, strictly speaking, not thought of as possible. Why? Well, I'm simplifying a little bit. But in brief, human beings had thought of, and they'd always thought of, the world either as having always existed, right, from forever, this is how Plato thinks of the world, or as in the Jewish and Christian traditions, as having been created at a specific moment in time, but created entirely, right, in total perfection. Okay? And so it followed from these preconceptions that everything that exists, every idea, every form, every innovation, exists already, right, or has been conceived, thought of, anticipated in the mind of the ultimate creator, in the mind of God. You get access to that way of thinking by looking at the etymologies of words like discover, right? Think about discovering as coming across something new, but if you think about the etymology, literally it's discover, to uncover, right? To uncover or to reveal something that was already there, right? The word invent is an even better example. We think of invention and inventors, people who do something entirely new. And yet the Latin root here is invenire, which literally means to sort of come across or to come upon. Anyone studied German, you'll know that the word to invent is erfinden, literally to find, right? To find something that already exists. The word create is even more interesting in this connection. There's an old Christian theological maxim that says, solus Deus creat, that God alone creates, right? God is the only true creator, the creator omnium, the creator of all. And human beings, strictly speaking, can't create, right? We can only recreate. We can imitate the perfect creation of God. All these notions are not explicitly and directly challenged until the 18th century, with the emergence of the notion of a concept of genius. And with it comes the belief that human beings not only can create, but that they should create, and they should do so originally. Okay? And as a consequence, that we are deserving of the fruits of our labor. And so copyright law, right, and the assumption that to copy is to steal, right, or to carry out a cheap knockoff or an imitation, to carry out a theft, is a product of this same shift. If human beings create, they are the owners of their creation and hence should reap the benefits. I love to tell students of 18th century France that in 18th century French law, the king is the owner of the copyright on all books and ideas. The king gets royalties, right? And that's where we get the term. Why? Well, because a king is the representative of God on earth, and God is the creator of all ideas and all thought, and so the middleman gets a cut, right? It's a very, very kind of foreign way of thinking of these matters, but as I say, most human beings in most societies until the 18th century thought of creation in this way. To create was to recreate the perfect forms that had been laid out before, to imitate, to perform mimesis, which is the dominant theory of aesthetics in the West, really until the 18th century. Now in the Renaissance, even though you're getting closer to a notion of genius, that ideal of mimesis still holds. And so even someone like Michelangelo, who is surely doing what no one else had done before, there's not the same tendency to speak of him in terms of his originality, in terms of his imaginative newness. And so not to speak of him of genius as a genius in this modern sense. Okay, so we have this body of ancient reflection that is in turn Christianized and extended in the Renaissance and in the centuries thereafter. And it's a body of reflection that carries with it two fundamental assumptions. Okay? One, that to produce beyond normal human capacities is to be godlike. is to lay claim to something divine. And two, that this power, for the same reason, can easily be abused, right? To be in possession of godlike power is to be tempted. The divine fury is a kind of madness, after all, a kind of a possession, and those who possess it may be tempted to take that gift and to use it inappropriately, as the highest of the angels, Lucifer, was said to have done, as Faust in more recent myth was said to have done as well. This is Rembrandt's rendering of the Faust myth, right? A man who seeks total knowledge, who seeks divine knowledge, and of course, who falls into the clutches of Satan as a consequence. The lineage of genius, in other words, has a venerable connection not only to madness, but also to evil, transgression, and crime. All that is by way of backstory, okay? But the genius, as I've suggested, is a new model of the highest human type. Only emerges in the 18th century, in the age that scholars call the Age of Enlightenment. And so the question becomes why, right? Why in this period to see this cult of genius and this reverence for this new type of being? It's a complicated question, and I devote a lot of attention to it in the book, and I would argue that like any complex historical question, it's multi-causal. There are different things going on, right? Changes in the economy, there are changes in aesthetics, and social structure, all of which enter into the story. And yet what I ultimately try to do is to consider the emergence of the cult of genius in the 18th century and the considerable fascination with geniuses thereafter in light of two large contexts that other accounts have tended to overlook. And the first has to do with religious change, and more specifically what has been called the withdrawal of God. The haunting sense that the creator that, while by no means absent entirely from the universe, is nonetheless less present than before, less active in day-to-day human affairs, right? Which is a development or a sentiment, a feeling that gives rise, on the one hand, to a sense of anxiety as human beings sort of struggle with a sense of absence or loss. And yet at the same time, it gives rise to an enhanced sense of agency as human beings take over realms that had hitherto been ceded to God or the gods. What I want to argue is that the genius emerges in this space, right? In this newly configured space. And the genius emerges at the same time that human beings are coming to disavow a whole variety of different intermediary figures or higher beings who had long been thought to sort of stand on the great chain of existence between God and man, right? Beings like saints, like prophets, like angels, and indeed like genii, right, in the older sense of the Roman and Greek terms. So the withdrawal of God and the clearing of the heavens of these mediating figures and higher beings creates a conceptual space for the emergence of a new type of human intermediary, a higher human being who can stand between ordinary humanity and the divine, interpreting, making sense of the universe, continuing to invest it and to invest us with wonder. Contemporaries themselves are conscious of this change, and they speak and write of the modern genius often as a kind of stand-in for the older genius or angels of old. And they frequently make this connection iconographically as well, as in this depiction of Voltaire, the genius, with his genius up above him, his guardian angel, as if the two are somehow one. All kinds of illustrations of this in the 18th century. This is another rendering of Voltaire and Rousseau being led to the Pantheon, which is the resting place of the men and now women of the patrie, of the fatherland, that's created in the French Revolution on the model of the older Roman Pantheon. It was a former church, and so literally when Voltaire's remains are brought to the Pantheon, when Rousseau's remains are transferred there, they become sort of secular saints, modern religious figures, right? Even more often, contemporaries speak of these geniuses not as angels or as genie in the older sense, but as I say, of saints. And this is very clear with somebody like Newton. Right? Newton, whom contemporaries like Edmund Halley of the comet fame, Halley's Comet, described as straddling the insuperable line, the nice barrier twixt human and divine. Others argued, like one contemporary, that Newton's virtues proved him a saint whose discoveries might well pass for miracles. How fitting, then, that his body, too, should be received at his death in 1727 at Westminster Abbey, resting place of the saints of old. Newton, divinely touched, was a genius put among us to capture and to reveal the truth. And this is a rendering. It's actually from the frontispiece by a work by Voltaire called The Elements of the Philosophy of Newton. Voltaire was interested in Newtonian philosophy, and he was an important sort of publicizer for Newton's ideas in French. And his mistress, this woman here, an 18th century genius, Madame de Châtelet, was Newton's principal translator. And so this frontispiece or engraving shows Newton literally sort of shining divine light that's reflected by Châtelet, in turn engulfing another genius, Voltaire. And these kind of religious renderings of these secular figures are very common. This is a painting by Fragonard, the 18th century French painter of Fragonard himself. And what's interesting about it is it shows Fragonard in a traditional religious pose, the pose of a prophet or a saint whose attention is arrested by an epiphany, right, by the emergence of an angel or revelation of the Holy Spirit. And so again, it's a kind of secularized rendering of an older religious theme. Now, the point of these comparisons between the modern genius and earlier religious figures or spiritual beings is not to insist upon any crude or direct correspondence between the ancient and the modern types. It's rather to make the point that the modern genius retains a kind of religious aura, and so is invested with exceptional powers. Powers of creation, but also of destruction. Powers of vision and of prophecy, of salvation and redemption, that are all arguably all the more mysterious for not being explicitly recognized as religious. Geniuses in the 18th century and thereafter are imagined as privileged beings who can see into the fabric of the universe, or who can see into our souls. They're like patron saints who can seemingly embody the broader spirit or genius of the people or the times, the genius populi. Thus Shakespeare, of course, is an Elizabethan playwright who had long been thought of as a wise poet and man of the stage, is conceived for the first time in the 18th century as a genius. And not only that, but as a man who somehow embodies Englishness, right? This despite the fact that he's also thought of as unlike any other human being who's ever lived. He's entirely unique and yet at the same time representative of the whole. Right? Goethe, by the end of the 18th and into the 19th century, is being thought of in these ways. So is Benjamin Franklin, really the first American genius, later arguably Edison, and also Napoleon in France. Napoleon's somebody who plays a quite important role in my book, in part because he's really the first figure to take advantage of this new cult of genius. For the whole 18th century, people are holding up geniuses as higher human beings who have miraculous powers. And Napoleon realizes that there's sort of political capital to be made out of this. And he uses genius very self-consciously as a way to justify and legitimate his rule. And if you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, here's a guy who he doesn't have any dynastic claim, right? He's a minor aristocrat. He's not heir to the great dynastic or royal lines. He doesn't really have a democratic legitimacy. And yet he can dominate a room, right? He can impress people with his mind, and he surely has that gift. And so he uses this, and it's something that I think historians haven't picked up on. He uses it very self-consciously in his propaganda. So this here is an image from the Empire period, which presents Napoleon as literally as the master of the universe, right? Who has become one with his star. And there's a whole tradition of thinking about Napoleon as being sort of divinely guided by a star or by a comet figure that is a symbol of his fate his fate and his sort of his chosen role in the world. Now, in keeping with this, of course, is the idea that being divinely touched can also lead one astray, right? And here's an English rendering, or actually, no, this is a German caricature. There are English characters like this as well, of Napoleon as literally the son of Satan, with this sort of ironic line from the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, from the Luther Bible, "Here is my beloved son with whom I'm well pleased." Okay, so I'm going to go back to my... The point that I'm developing with all this is that genius, long after the fact, retains an earlier connection to the magical, to the mysterious, to the divine, to the transcendent. This despite the fact that there's a concerted effort in the 18th century to disenchant genius, right? To explain genius in purely irrational terms. And that's something else that I'm happy to talk about at greater length if you'd like to in the question period. But the point for now, the takeaway, is that that effort to disenchant genius in the 18th century fails. It fails already, I would argue, in the 18th century, and it fails even more so in the century and a half that follows, when this long-standing tendency to speak of genius in terms of the divine gets reimagined and reinvented and presented in new ways. And this is above all the case in Germany, okay? Though by no means only in Germany, but in Germany above all. Where already by the 1830s, someone like David Friedrich Strauss, who's one of the first biographers of Jesus, he writes a quite scandalous biography of Jesus, treating him as a historical figure and not as simply a divine figure. Strauss can write in the 1830s that the only cult which is left over from the religious debris of the preceding cults for the educated of our time is the cult of genius. And one finds similar statements among romantic writers and philosophers who pile on lavish speculation on the genius's powers of prophecy and revelation, of the ability of geniuses to translate and to capture and to embody universal truths and deep spiritual longings. Genius is religious, Ralph Waldo Emerson claims, and that claim is repeated so often and in so many forms that by the early 20th century, it's a commonplace. Right? Analysts like the Austrian historian Edgard Zissel are speaking openly of what Zissel describes in a book of that name as die Genie-Religion, the genius religion, or the religion of genius. And the epigraph, one of the epigraphs to my book is from one of these analysts, a man by the name of Wilhelm Lange-Eichbaum, who writes a book that's published in 1931 called The Problem of Genius, a different sort of problem, in which he has the line, "Among modern civilized beings, a reverence for genius has become a substitute for the lost dogmatic religions of the past." The religion of genius is a religion replete with its own cult of relics, with its own martyrs, with its own places of pilgrimage. And this is something that I do quite a lot of in the book. I look at this kind of cult of relics of geniuses. This is the finger, one of several fingers of Galileo that were removed when his body was translated to the Santa Croce Cathedral, where it is now in Florence. This finger is actually now at the Museum of Science in Florence, but you see that it's sort of presented in literally a reliquary, right? Like the reliquaries of the saints. This is Voltaire's heart being deposited in the National Library. His remains were taken to the Pantheon, as I've said, in 1791, but his brain and his heart were removed and purchased and sold. The brain has gone missing. We don't know where it is. But the heart was put into a statue of Voltaire by Houdon, one of the great sculptors of the 18th century, and then everyone forgot about it. A couple of years ago, you may have read in the newspapers, they moved this statue, and there was this foul smell in the old Bibliothèque Nationale, and they, took the statue off, and they found the heart sort of decaying in the center of it. Right? That's the skull of René Descartes. There's a wonderful book on the kind of translation of his body and skull from Sweden, where he died, back to France by Russell Shorto. You'll see there's writing all over the front of it. People inscribed their names in it. It's now in the Museum of Science. People took pieces of it and made, during the French Revolution, carved rings out of it and whatnot. Again, to literally sort of be next to or close to the body of a genius. That's a lock of hair from Napoleon. There's a vast trade in Napoleonic relics in the 19th century of all different things, right? Pieces of hair and body parts, including, it's believed, Napoleon's penis. It's okay to laugh. Right? I don't have a picture of Napoleon's penis. In the accounts of it by British soldiers, they said it was underwhelming or less inspiring than you might have thought. But literally, something purporting to be the penis was purchased at the end of the 19th century from the estate of the Corsican priest, the Abbé Vignale, who performed last rites after Napoleon's death, said to have removed it. A trader from London buys it. He sells it to a trader from Philadelphia by the name of Rosenbach, who displays it publicly in Philadelphia and then again in New York. And it's purchased, I swear I'm not making this up, it's purchased by Columbia University urologist by the name of Charles Lattimore, who just died recently, and so it may be going on the market again. I think he paid something like $40,000 for it. It's amusing, but it's also, I think, revealing of this way in which geniuses are thought of as constitutionally and fundamentally different. Okay, what goes with that is a kind of emergence of pilgrimages to the birthplaces or the special sites of geniuses in the 19th century. So this is, of course, Stratford-upon-Avon, which is Shakespeare's home, which is purchased by a society of friends of Shakespeare in the middle of the 19th century, and then rendered what it is today, right? A special site of pilgrimage. And this is a postcard from the 1920s, right? For British, for American, and also for German tourists who are very invested in the Shakespeare cult. The same is true of Goethe's home. Goethe's home in Weimar, which is purchased in 1885 by the German government, where Goethe lived for the last 40 or 50 years of his life. You can still go there and see Goethe's study where the great thoughts happened. Looks very much like it does in this postcard from the 1930s. Or you can go to the house of Friedrich Nietzsche, transformed after his death into an archive. Actually, not the house of Nietzsche himself, but the house of his sister, who took care of Nietzsche in the last 10 years of his life when he had descended in a kind of madness. And there he is, the last 10 years. And already in his life, his house became a kind of pilgrimage site. People came from all over Europe to pay homage to the great philosopher. And then when he died, the house itself was transformed into literally this shrine. The great Belgian modernist interior designer and architect Henri van de Velde did these interiors. They're absolutely stunning. Max Klinger did this sculpture here of Nietzsche, and then all his works and manuscripts are there, and it's almost as if you literally would pay homage to a saint. That is Wanfried, the house of Wagner, which stands to this day and continues to be a kind of shrine, and Wagner's another important figure in the genius cult and in the story that I want to tell. Okay, well, to see the genius as a figure of special election in this religious sense goes hand in hand with the other main context in which I try to understand the emergence of genius and its enduring fascination in the modern world. And that is the simultaneous emergence of a discourse about human equality. And it's one of these strange ironies at the very same period that gives rise to the birth of the genius as a figure of startling and dramatic exception also gives rise to the claim that all human beings are created equal, a proposition that Thomas Jefferson can regard by 1776 as a self-evident truth. We know, of course, that Jefferson didn't really believe this, that he, like so many other contemporaries, was quick to enumerate exceptions to his own general rule. So women, people of color, Native Americans did not apparently merit equal treatment or equal consideration. And in the 19th century, other categories of peoples, including Jews and Aboriginals, the allegedly unfit, were shown on the basis of a spurious science and anthropology to be less than equal, so undeserving of the same rights supposedly enjoyed by all. Well, what I try to show in the book is that the discussion of genius is the mirror image of all this. That geniuses, too, are considered exceptions to the ordinary laws of nature, but their exception affords them greater consideration, not less. Right? Jefferson, in fact, considered geniuses to be part of what he and others called in the 18th century a natural aristocracy, an aristocracy based on creativity and intelligence, among other criteria that might now be used to buttress a new order and hierarchy in a world that was increasingly less inclined to sanction notions of aristocracy based on titles, lineage, and inherited privilege. Geniuses, in other words, become a kind of foil to equality. They are exceptions to the norm, beings whom Kant can describe as nature's favorite. Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, and as many of you will know, the father of eugenics, puts it slightly differently in his major work of 1869, Hereditary Genius. And Galton is very interested in trying to figure out how many geniuses might emerge in a population pool and how this might be controlled. And Galton observes in this work that geniuses are grand human animals of natures preeminently noble who are born to be kings of men. These creatures, Galton writes, appear on Earth only at the rate of 1 in 10 million, right? And he thereby gives a kind of statistical sanction to the genius's special election. There's a whole science that develops out of the 18th century, continues into the 19th century and the early 20th century, that's devoted to showing where genius is, to identifying it, to proving its existence, right? It's a science that I call genealogy, G-E-N-I-O-L-O-G-Y. It's a science that begins with physiognomy. And this is from a book by Johann Caspar Lafayette, the father of physiognomy, the study of the science of faces. And he's terribly interested in trying to identify genius. Right? We know geniuses exist. We know that they are these great and special beings, unlike anyone else. How do we recognize them, right? How do we single them out? Well, if you're a genius like Lafayette and you have a special ability, you can read it in the face, right? And so these are silhouettes, as you all will see clearly, of geniuses, right? These are the eyes of a genius, okay? And he has, drawing after drawing upon this, and he analyzes Newton and Shakespeare and other great geniuses. We laugh at this kind of thing now, but it's important to realize that physiognomy remains an important current into the 20th century. And this is from a book by a man by the name of Ernst Kretschmer, who's a German psychologist who, in the very year that he publishes the German edition of this book, 1929, is awarded a Nobel Prize, not for this work, but for another. And Kretschmer is very interested in identifying genius and facial characteristics, and this is the type of the Jewish genius. Now, Kretschmer is not an anti-Semite, something of a rarity in this kind of line of inquiry at this time. But Jews, for reasons that I'll talk about in a moment, are a problem for people who study genius and the science of genius because they don't fit what others think is the norm. So there's physiognomy. There's also craniometry, the study of skulls, right? Clearly, geniuses have bigger brains, right? So they have bigger skulls, right? So here you have proof of this. This is the skull of Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher of the 19th century, mapped against the skull of Talleyrand, another French statesman, Schiller, and Napoleon, and I can't read that one there. And then at the bottom, a cretin. Right? So in other words, a kind of aboriginal figure. And this craniometry, craniological studies are often invested in a very explicit kind of racial typology that has male geniuses of white European stock on one end and everybody else descending from there. people are really interested in this. So in 1880, they dig up the grave of Immanuel Kant to study his skull, and this is big public news around Europe. There's also a whole raft and wave of grave robbings in the 19th century, where people, they steal Goya's skull or Beethoven's skull. They try to break into the graves and steal relics because they're worth a lot of money. There's another rendering of Kant's skull by the Italian theorist Cesare Lombroso, who has this medical theory that genius is a kind of degeneration. It's a sickness or an illness. This is an old notion, but he gives it a kind of scientific legitimacy in the 19th century, he and others. This is a drawing from another French theorist of this degeneration theory, as is noticed. And you can't really see this engraving very well, but right here is an exceptional intelligence in various branches of genius, which is right above the branch for crime and prostitution, alcoholism, and also utopian thinking, right? So another form of sickness. But, Lombroso is a criminologist as well, and he also has this view that genius and crime go together. He's obsessed with modern statistics, like Galton, and he thinks that you can use mathematics and statistics to show all kinds of revealing things about genius, like the relation of average monthly temperature to admission of lunatics in asylums and to the production of works of genius. And here you have these very serious-looking graphs showing us just this. The intelligence quotient science, incidentally, emerges directly out of this same genealogy in the 19th century, and there are things to say about that as well. Okay. As Lombroso takes pains to show, as Galton and others take pains to show, if the geniuses are scientifically exceptions to normal human equality, if they have special privileges, then everything ought to be permitted to them, right? The man of genius, as Lombroso puts it in a work of that name, operates according to a special morality. Everything is permitted to genius. They're not bound by ordinary laws. Okay, so in the very last chapter of the book, I try to show how this profoundly racist and anti-Semitic genealogical science is put to the service of the religion of genius, and how, in conjunction with the belief in the genius's moral license and exception, these two things come together in quite a terrible way around the Nazi cult of genius, centered on Adolf Hitler, who, to an even greater degree than Napoleon, makes genius and his own genius, however absurd that may seem to us today, a centerpiece of his propaganda. And this is something, again, that I don't think historians have fully appreciated, that Hitler self-consciously exploits this quite important and fundamental genius discourse, or Genie-Gedanke. In Germany, this is just a pamphlet from 1930 by a German cultural historian. The genius as Führer, genius as leader. Hitler writes about himself as a genius in Mein Kampf at some length. He goes about seeking out the approbation of important cultural figures in Germany to give him the stamp or the imprimatur of genius, as strange as that may sound to us. The very fact that he's a failed art student and a failed architect actually feed into this myth, because there's a certain way of considering geniuses so far advanced and so far ahead of their time that they won't be appreciated by their contemporaries, right? And so the fact that Hitler's not appreciated at the beginning of his career is somehow a validation of his actual genius. The fact that he rants and raves before audiences gives him this slight air of mania or madness or fury that also fits into the cult. The fact that he is militarily, particularly early on, willing to break all the rules, to do everything that his generals tell him not to, creates and enhances this mystique. And he himself goes out of his way to promote this cult. So there's a whole series of Nazi films on German genius and on German geniuses. This is Schiller, the great contemporary of Goethe, a great German poet, the triumph of his genius. And he's made into a kind of Nazi. And there are films on Michelangelo and a whole Frederick the Great and a whole variety of others presented in this way. There's Hitler, he goes around Germany visiting all the important sites of geniuses. So there's Hitler visiting the Nietzsche archives, and Nietzsche's sister, who was in fact a fascist, an anti-Semite, and quite an unsavory human being, still alive. I think she's in her 90s at this point. Hitler pays homage. He goes to the archive, views the statue of Nietzsche, and as wits have pointed out, Nietzsche's cut off, implying that Hitler is a half-wit, but nonetheless. There's Hitler at Bayreuth, the opera house built by Wagner. Of course, he's a great admirer and lover of Wagner. And then finally, there's Hitler in front of the house, the famous statue of Schiller and Goethe in Weimar, and he pays homage to Goethe's house as well. There's Hitler, of course, looking down on the tomb of Napoleon, literally higher than the angels. Well, fortunately, the history of genius, like my book itself, has a slightly more upbeat ending, in that I try to show how the Nazis in general and Hitler in particular are obsessed with the figure of Albert Einstein, the good genius, as it were, who embodies a rival myth that, of course, discredits Hitler's own. Pitting Hitler against Einstein is not just a dramatic convention on my part, but was thought of in these terms by contemporaries, a kind of clash of the titans. And I cite a study, a poll from 1939 taken amongst Princeton University undergraduates, who is the most important person in the world. Adolf Hitler, 1. Albert Einstein, 2. What's particularly depressing about that is Einstein, of course, is resident on Princeton University's campus and had been since 1935. But the people in this period see Hitler and Einstein as kind of, of rival gods, duking it out in a Götterdämmerung, in a clash of titans or gods. Well, the Princeton University undergraduates, fortunately, would come in due course to see things differently as virtually everyone else in the world. And so Time's Man of the Year of 1938, Adolf Hitler, who was a kind of Wagnerian organist playing a hymn of hate here, submits to the superior power of Einstein, the cosmoclast. Where's my last slide? Promise you. It died on me at the end. Okay, only goes one way. Can we Where's the best place to point this? There you go. Thank you. I'll give you a little feedback to come. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. But it is dramatic, right? It's the cover of Time magazine in 1946, right? And it's the kind of last traces of this myth of Einstein, not as just an avenging angel, right? As a good genius, but a good genius with the power of total destruction, the power literally to destroy the world, cosmoclast. Okay. Most of you know, I'm sure, that Einstein has nothing to do with the creation of the atomic bomb, right? I mean, his science actually is not even important in the development of the bomb. He writes a letter supporting it famously, but he's not the genius behind the atomic bomb, and yet this image is still there. Einstein triumphing over Hitler. In the conclusion to the book, I try to show how Einstein was really the last of the geniuses conceived in the model of human transcendence that takes hold beginning in the 18th century, the last of the saints in the genius religion. And yet the larger and more important story is the way in which Einstein himself resisted precisely this kind of worship, the way in which other social forces serve to undercut the genius religion in the aftermath of 1945. The science of genius largely went out of fashion. Scientists themselves, for the most part, stopped using the term. Academics and others cast aspersions on the cult of great men as elitist and sexist and racist. And of course, the direct ties between the cult of genius and eugenics and Hitler served to render talk of genius and geniuses taboo. With good reason, then, did men and women grow wary of the dangers of bowing before idols. And as they did so, they came to appreciate what one research director at the storied firm of Arthur D. Little observed even before the war, that organized research, as he put it, does not depend upon individual genius, it is group activity. Right? Many heads are better than one. There's wisdom in crowds, we now know, right? Genius in networks and groups, emotional intelligence, multiple intelligence. There's a bit of genius in us all. Democracy and equality in the end have had the last laugh, pulling the towering genius down to size, a development that on the whole, I think, has been for the good. And yet it follows from this same development that a world in which everyone can be a genius, a world in which everyone has a genius for something, is properly speaking a world in which the genius is startling exception can no longer exist. In that respect, the genius is dead, or at least has been cut down to size. And while there are, as I've suggested, good reasons why we shouldn't be too quick to mourn the passing, I also think that we need to recognize that we lose something when we no longer allow ourselves to wonder and marvel at human greatness. If it is true that those who prostrate themselves before idols make themselves small, it's no less true that those who fail to take the measure of true stature are diminished. Thank you for putting up with feedback and all the rest. Happy to entertain questions, comments, angry tirades, or whatever you have to throw at me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And now for a very different sort of feedback. Alison Bruff, are you around someplace? Here she is. Okay, she's got the mic and she's going to carry it around for anyone who has a question for Professor McMahon.
Hi, thank you very much. Have you heard of a book called Regression in the Service of the Ego?
I have not.
Okay, I studied this in graduate school. It was a theory that it countered the theory that artists are crazy. And what it did was it looked back in history and did psychological profiles of successful artists, and it also looked at successful creative people currently and administered the MMPI and looked at indices on there, one of the ability to dip down into the unconscious or to let the unconscious in, and the other ego strength. And what was found was that the difference between artists and crazy people was that the artists were able to use it and come back.
Right.
And your talk reminds me of that a little bit.
No, thank you very much for that comment. It's an important one. And it reminds me, too, of another figure who's central to this story, a psychologist at Stanford University by the name of Lewis Terman. And you may have heard of the Stanford Binet Intelligence Quotient exam. Lewis Terman was the principal person who took the original research by a French psychologist by the name of Binet and sort of instrumentalized it to make the IQ exam kind of a tool that can be used widely. Terman began his studies as a student of genius. He was an acolyte of Galton, among others. And he wants to kind of test this old idea that genius and madness are related. And there is this science in the 19th century, as I say, that says that genius and madness go together. And he finds what the author you cite finds when he does these long-term longitudinal studies of people with IQs over 140, identifies termites, they're called, little children in the San Francisco Bay Area, and follows them over the course of a lifetime. And what he finds, like what Galton had argued, is that geniuses are actually closer to the mean in terms of normal sort of mental well-being, that in other words they're not unfit, and that they're healthier, more robust psychologically, and I think by and large that holds true. The one exception, because people ask about this a lot, why there's this old belief that goes back to Plato and Aristotle, revived in the Renaissance, there's a romantic twist on this, there's a 19th century scientific twist on this, that associate genius and madness. And I think it may be true that in certain fields, like poetry, there's something to this. Why poetry? Well, you think of poets are people who are particularly adept at drawing metaphor or simile from disparate things, or pulling things that an ordinary human being wouldn't say, oh, wow, my love is not like a rose, right? But poets do that well, right? If you go a little bit farther on the spectrum, that becomes a kind of schizophrenia, right? Where you're pulling literally disassociated things together. And it may be that people with poetic talent are close on the edge there. And so there may be some cases in which there's some truth to the adage, but I think in most cases, no, that actually people of exceptional intelligence and creative capacity, as you say, are well put together psychologically.
Hello. Okay. Given what you said about genius and its death almost, how should we consider cult classics like David Foster Wallace or William Butler Yeats, Robert Frost, Marcel Proust within the 20th, 21st century spectrum?
Wonderful question. So, I think somebody like Proust is already part of the canon, right? And so he's a genius in an older sense. I think the way people, particularly of your generation, would deal with somebody like Wallace is to call him a genius. And yet, I think you need to recognize that we use that term for anybody and everybody now, right? And so one of the things I'm suggesting is to use the word so liberally as to sap it of its special something. Clearly, David Foster Wallace had a special something, right? Whether he was a genius in the pantheon, in the way that a lot of people I write about, hard to tell. And it may be only time will tell. In fact, this is one of the things that I write about in one of the ways in which modern geniuses and saints are alike, is that most geniuses are dead, right? You have to be dead and dead for a while for people to really kind of take stock and measure, right? Will people be writing and thinking about David Foster Wallace in another century's time? They may well be, but that'll be the test, right? Well, whether or not he can, and his work and his body of work can resonate and continue to resonate with successive generations, the way that some of the figures that you read in Search have continued to do for so many, for so long.
Hi. I wrote my question down. So, accepting the definition of genius as exceptions to society, do you believe that the qualities of genius are formed predominantly by nature or nurture or both?
That's a wonderful question. So the question is, whether geniuses are from nature or by nurture. Well, one of the things I always have trouble answering these kind of questions about definitions of genius, because as a historian, we don't begin with an essentialized notion of what a genius is and then, work from there. We look at changing definitions. So this can get you into trouble. When I wrote this book on happiness a number of years ago, I remember very well having an interview with an AP reporter who came in. He was going to write a story, and he says, "So how do you define genius?" Right? And I said, "Well, you do what the people in the humanities do. It's very interesting. Let's consider that question, right? It's a problematic statement." And I said, "Well, there are different ways of defining happiness, and one of the things the book does is follow these changing definitions over time." And he said, yeah, but what's genius? I mean, what's happiness? Tell me what happiness is." And of course, I couldn't give him a blanket universal definition. And so what did he do? He went away and wrote a story, professor of happiness can't define happiness. That was his lead line. Thanks, right? So, okay, back to your question. One of the things that I try to point out in the book is that although there's a long-standing debate between nature and nurture, in fact, it goes all the way back to Pindar, right, in the ancient Greek world, whether or not genius is something that can be learned or acquired, or whether it's natural, given by the gods, or innate. That debate gets revived in the 18th century. And there are a whole number of people who depart from an epistemology, a study of the human mind, that's based upon the work of John Locke, the great English political theorist, who has this idea that the mind is a tabula rasa, that the mind is a blank slate, and that everything that we know in the world is simply acquired or learned, right? Many people in the 18th century take that notion and say, oh, well, then genius is really just a function of exposure, of training, right? There's a modern variant of this notion that some of you may be familiar with. Malcolm Gladwell has written about it. It's based actually on, the hard science here is based on the work of a colleague of mine by the name of Anders Ericsson, who's the one who formulates what Gladwell calls the 10,000-hour rule. And what Gladwell says is actually, if you look at somebody like Mozart, or you look at, great hockey players, or people who are excellent, often the crucial difference is what Anders calls deliberate practice, that they have early exposure and they practice more. And so, Mozart is a son of a music teacher, and he's practicing exposed to music in a central way from very early on. So that argument exists in the 18th century, and I think it's a very compelling one, frankly, because I think there's a danger in looking at geniuses as these special, rarefied beings who are fundamentally unlike you or I. I also think that there are strong psychological forces at play. When we do that, it kind of gets us off the hook, right? In fact, Nietzsche writes about this, among others, that geniuses are different. I'm pretty good, but I'm not Shakespeare, but that's not my fault, I don't have to work too hard. It gets parents off the hook, right? Parents in the audience know that you have limited time and energy, and if you have 4 children and one of them is really good at something, well, then you can invest your energy in them and pretend like they're naturally, gifted, right? And it's not your fault that you didn't devote, okay? That argument is made in the 18th century, and it's a compelling one, I would argue. It's a progressive one. It puts the onus on society to develop individuals. And yet what I try to show is that argument loses out, and it loses out in a profound way. So that the dominant notion of genius that emerges in the 18th century and then is kind of reified by the science in the 19th century, 1 in 10 million, is that genius is innate. Genius, it's an old play on the Latin adage that, poet is born, not made, right? That genius is born and not made, that genius cannot be learned. And that's the argument that really holds out. I think it holds out through a lot of the IQ science, the notion of a G factor, or general intelligence, that's added to the notion of IQ later. And I think, frankly, at the end of the day, while no one's going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that, that there's nothing to genetics and birth, clearly there is, right? At the same time, being overly invested in that idea of certain people are special, rarefied, and different from you or I is not only, I think, profoundly in tension with basic notions of human equality, but not the basis for developing a progressive society, when we should be in the business of, I think, developing talent in as many places and in as many people as we can. That was a long-winded answer to your question. I'm sorry, but I think it's an important theme, so thank you for bringing it up.
There's another aspect in this nature-nurture debate that I don't think has ever been talked about to any great extent, and that is, it depends on where you're at. Physically, geographically, time-wise. Gladwell does a little bit of this, but if Beethoven, for instance, were born in central China, symphonic music would not have developed the way that it did, because Beethoven in central China did not have the tools to do symphonies. Nor would he have the internet available to him to broadcast the result of his genius, even if he were working with the pipa instead of with the violin. One reason we have so many geniuses at the moment is, number one, we have so many more people than we used to, and number two, we've got so much more media to broadcast the accomplishments of those people much further than they could have back in central China or pre-Enlightenment days.
That's a wonderful point, and I only just at the very end identified you. I couldn't see who was speaking. It was a kind of disembodied voice of wisdom and sagacity. Thank you. You're absolutely right. And again, so I love the 18th century, and so I'm always happy to credit the 18th century. There's one of these theorists, one of these kind of nature guys in the 18th century by the name of, he has a terribly long 18th century French name, but the last name is Helvétius, and was an important philosopher in 18th century France. And he says exactly this, that genius is a function of timing and of place, right? And timing is a part of this as well, right? If Darwin hadn't come up with the theory of evolution, well, Wallace was already on his tails and somebody else would have, right? May have taken 20 years to get the theory of relativity, but we would have gotten it, right, eventually. So timing is partly, right? But also, as you say, being in the right place in the right time. Central China and Beethoven, one example, think of people in the 10, 12,000 BC, born with phenomenal IQs, right? And it goes lost. And think of the tragic loss in human potential that is wasted every day in failing public school systems, or in parts of this country that don't give school children the resources to develop the talents early on. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that this is a theme, as I say, that's already being acknowledged and addressed to some degree in the 18th century. But again, it's taken in a different way, and it's taken in a different way in a kind of perverse sense, in that this gets racialized, right? So geniuses grow in certain soil, and geniuses are expression of certain racial characteristics. And so, yes, genius only happens in certain places, but it only happens in kind of European societies, right? That's obviously a different line of inquiry. I think it is true that there is a kind of whole thinking now about networks and how networks operate. That's kind of getting into this idea. In fact, I have a friend who's an NPR reporter who's writing a book right now on the genius of place. And he wrote a wonderful book on happiness, where he goes and tries to find the happiest place in the world. And now he's writing a book on genius, and goes to Silicon Valley, and he goes to Florence and other centers of great thought to kind of look at the cross-fertilization and sort of synergies that happen in centers of creativity. So again, thank you for that comment. This is like, it's like the end of the semester when you get the hardcore with you who are there to the bitter end, and these are the students and people that you love, so thank you all.
Since Madame de Châtelet, was that her name?
Absolutely,
Was
yeah.
the only woman you mentioned by name?
Yeah.
It would seem to me it's not just time and place, it's also gender and sex
Yeah.
and race and all those
Sure.
other criteria you suggested have been patently
Yeah.
ignored. Could you think back on if it had been possible to consider females for this quality, who might have been?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, there's an embarrassment of riches of intelligent, creative women through the ages, right? And one of the stories of my story is the way in which women fight against and then ultimately kind of explode this very gendered category. I mean, the idea of genius is profoundly gendered. It's in the word itself, as I said. It again uses the male spirit. Women don't have genie in this sense. But the very word, the root is genogenere, which means to father, right? To beget, to generate, right? It's the same word that gives us genes, and it also gives us genitals, right? I have a line. Sorry, yeah, well, probably, yeah. Actually, well, there's a good point, right? But it's thought of always in the kind of active sense, right? I mean, obviously, this is a prejudice. But sometimes I quote this German thinker of the 18th century, J.J. Hamann, who says that, it's impossible for me to think of a great creative spirit without male genitalia. And that's in keeping with the dominant kind of narrative that has old roots. It's challenged, though, and people begin to challenge it in the 18th century. So there's this wonderful line when Madame de Stael, who's another one I write about, who is clearly a genius, who writes a novel about a female genius and the difficulties therein, who is said to have exclaimed before Napoleon when she entered his bedchamber and he was dressing, and the aide tried to stop her, "Genius has no sex," right? And you get this assertion in the 19th century by people like George Eliot, or George Sand, clearly Madame de Curie, most explicitly by someone like Gertrude Stein, who opens one of her poems with the claim, "I am a genius." She knows exactly what she's doing, right? She's challenging head-on this kind of male narrative. That's one of the ways in which academics sort of went back in the post-45 period and sort of deconstructed this idea of genius and showed, look, there are all these associations with it. And yet I think we're maybe at the point now where, we're open-minded enough to think about female geniuses, right? And that we ought to be doing that. Jacques Derrida, the great French philosopher, gave one of the last public lectures of his career, making this claim about Hélène Cixous, who was a French novelist, and trying to kind of think or theorize a notion of genius that would shed its kind of gendered and other shadowy past. So women are part of the story, but it's a story that's it's a story of male prejudice and the challenge against that. Yeah. Who wrote the books, right? Well, yeah, but look, I mean, you can make the claim that, Jane Austen and George Eliot are, two of the greatest novelists who ever lived. And yet you rarely see, even now, hear that coupling Jane Austen as genius, in part because there's this profound male association. I mean, another example that I give of this, for those of you who've been to Paris, if you've been to the 6th arrondissement, you may have seen Rodin's famous sculpture of Balzac, right? Balzac wrote hundreds of novels, literally, and he would write at night, and he would drink strong cups of espresso. And of course, these are in houses that are not heated. And so he'd wear this big, heavy cloak. And if you look at the statue closely, I think there's another copy of it in Philadelphia, there's a kind of odd protrusion from the gown right here, and it's not clear what that is. Well, when Rodin died and they went into his studio, they found all these studies of Balzac nude, holding his phallus, right? Okay, an erect phallus, okay? Well, that's perfectly it. It's this kind of this association with genius, with generative power, right? With the power to inseminate, literally. I could qualify that in the sense that one of the things that is interesting is there is also a counter-narrative that emerges in the 19th century that associates genius and homosexuality. This happens around Byron, happens around Oscar Wilde, and the link here is that geniuses are original, and original in the 18th century meant not only doing something unique, but you're original. He's an original fellow, right? He's a queer fellow. He's unlike others. And geniuses are thought to have original characteristics. They're thought to be a little eccentric. They're thought to break established rules, to challenge established norms, including established gender norms. So Byron famously sleeps with people you're not supposed to, right? Relatives, other people's wives, men, right? And there's that association as well, right? And Gertrude Stein does something with that too. So there's a counter-narrative to this. And there's also a way in which certain of the qualities ascribed to geniuses are not only virile, masculine qualities, but they're also qualities that are associated with women. So hysteria, right, is women are thought of to be too sensible for their own good, too sensitive for their own good. They're prone to fits of hysteria. Well, geniuses are prone to fits of hysteria as well. They're also incredibly sensitive, and they suffer for that sensitivity. So the story is not quite as black and white as I'm making it, but those are the kind of main themes of it. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to cut you off. What I will invite you is to go back in the other room, purchase a copy of Professor McMahon's book, and he will be happy to sign it for you. In the meantime, please join me in thanking him for a presentation. Presentation that I think we can all agree was both generative and sensitive. Thank you very much.